People in narcissistic relationships frequently display signs of emotional dysregulation. In fact, emotional dysregulation is a symptom of narcissistic victim abuse syndrome. So in this two-part video series, I will be discussing the 8 signs of emotional dysregulation, and in part 2, I'll be discussing practical tips of how you can help yourself. I don't think we need to be any sort of mental health professional or any sort of therapist to realize that when we are consistently in unpredictable, unsafe environments, what I like to call crazy-making environments, it will make it very difficult for us to regulate our emotions. When our perception of reality is constantly messed around with, where we find ourselves repeatedly and consistently invalidated, threatened, intimidated, bullied, ignored, or betrayed. And this seems to be the foundation of all narcissistic relationships. It's like being on an emotional roller coaster where we eventually experience extreme emotional distress and our brain goes into survival mode. We are permanently on alert, and yes, it correlates to CPTSD. So people who are emotionally dysregulated feel like they have no control of their emotions. They are often completely overwhelmed by their emotions, and it seems like their emotions are controlling them. And they may self-medicate with food, with alcohol, with drugs, anything to help them cope with this emotional intensity. And people with BPD, which is borderline personality disorder, suffer an extreme emotional dysregulation. And whether these signs are actually officially labeled as a personality disorder is up to a mental health professional to assess. And of course, there are various other causes of emotional dysregulation, ranging from psychological and psychiatric illnesses to it actually being a symptom of post-traumatic stress and mood disorders. It may also be a symptom of a traumatic brain injury. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just sharing this information in the context of narcissistic abuse, because we often question why we are so emotionally overreacting and why we behave in an emotionally over-exaggerated manner. Emotional dysregulation is a really broad term that basically means that someone has difficulty managing their emotions. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have a personality disorder or a mental illness, but virtually all mental illnesses will involve a degree of emotional dysregulation. Being in controlling and narcissistic relationships makes us more susceptible to becoming emotionally imbalanced. We become easily triggered and we feel like our emotions are running our life. So it's important to recognize this because it has a huge impact on our quality of life. And signs of being emotionally dysregulated are often really subtle and they start off really slowly. And the longer you've been in a relationship with a narcissist, the more of these signs you will experience with greater frequency and intensity. But with all of that being said, I think most of us would agree that even just one conversation with a narcissist can make us question our sanity. So here are 8 signs that you may be emotionally dysregulated. Number 1 would have to be obsessive thoughts and behaviors. That's when we have irrational thoughts, when we replay memories. It could also include neurotic stalking, excessive worrying. So people might ask what constitutes as excessive. I think it's fair to say that if you are worrying for longer than an hour every single day to the point where it's affecting your ability to function in your life, that is excessive and it is problematic. Number 2 is hyper-adrenalized. So when your adrenals are over-aroused and your body is pumping out a lot of the stress hormones and you're constantly on edge. You can't rest, you can't sleep, your whole body just feels revved up. You're easily startled and you can't switch off. So you're in a continuous state of hyper-arousal. And physically, the way this can manifest is in things like having heart palpitations, being breathless, trembling, shaking, sweating. It could include dizziness or feelings like you're going to faint or you can't breathe. And Physiologically, this creates a very inflammatory internal state, and this is why people who do experience narcissistic abuse eventually manifest a lot of those chronic inflammatory disorders. Number 3, sign that you may be emotionally dysregulated is feeling the need to isolate. So you need to withdraw from others. You have a sense of social anxiety. So if you're constantly assessing another person's mood and intentions and behaviors, that constant assessment is exhausting. There is so much that feels like a threat to you in your environment that it's no wonder that you want to isolate yourself from people and just withdraw. It's because you're overwhelmed and you're overloaded. And under number 3, I'd also include having trouble managing that arousal, having trouble coping with things, and having a lot of feelings of being disoriented and confused. So all of that will lead you to wanting to isolate yourself. Number 4 is emotional hyperreactivity. And that's what emotional dysregulation has also been called. And that's when we feel vulnerable to negative emotions. We develop a high sensitivity and a high reactivity to negative emotions. And we're very easily triggered and then find it very difficult to return to the baseline. So emotionally dysregulated people will trigger very quickly, but then find it very difficult to calm themselves down again. And at the other extreme of this, some people can even develop something like an emotional phobia, where they have an inability to tolerate any emotions. Number 5 is anxiety, and that can range from anything from a very subtle apprehension to panic and paranoia. And that's because when you are in an unpredictable environment, in an unsure situation with a person that you don't trust, you live in a hypervigilant state, and it's a way that we try to protect ourselves from any potential harm. And of course, this can lead to developing a hypersensitivity where we are continuously assessing the other person's mood, their behavior, what's going on with them, their energy. So that constant assessment, that constant hypervigilance causes a lot of anxiety. Number 6 is depression. And depression is a loss of pleasure of the activities that we previously enjoyed. So all of a sudden we have no motivation, we have zero inspiration, we start wondering what's the point, and we do not understand the purpose of things. And under number 6, I'll also include mood fluctuation, which is usually driven by a really strong inner critic. So there's a lot of self-hatred and self-loathing and devaluing of ourselves. You know, one minute you feel okay and the next minute you absolutely can't stand yourself. So there's a really intense self-judgment. And of course, eventually that will lead to feelings of depression. Number 7 is black and white thinking, which is also known as splitting. And a classic example of when this is occurring is when you hear the person saying, "Nothing has ever worked for me." So nothing is a pretty strong word, and ever is a very strong word. So they'll have a lot of trouble understanding that there is a grey area. So when we get really emotionally dysregulated, it can cause us to think in a really dualistic black and white way, where we catastrophize and we only ever see two extremes. And number 8 of a sign that you may be emotionally dysregulated is by having a physiological dysregulation. So when we are in these toxic environments, in these unpredictable situations, we may start to develop digestive disturbance, where we feel so uptight, the anxiety is so overwhelming that we cannot digest our food. We've got stomach knots, so of course we're going to have digestive disturbance. And digestive disturbance eventually leads to other issues down the track. So there may be changes in appetite, changes in weight, so there'll be weight loss or weight gain, and eventually that can manifest in other dysregulations such as hormonal imbalance, and it goes on and on. In the context of being in a narcissistic relationship, in an unhealthy, controlling environment where we feel continuously threatened or intimidated, it's inevitable that this will have an impact on our ability to manage our emotional state. So I hope you found those insights helpful in your situation. Please do not label yourself with anything. These are just inevitable experiences when we are in a crazy making environment. So in part 2, I'm going to discuss practical tips of how you can help yourself emotionally regulate and what you can do to help yourself regain internal balance.